Hi there. This is Amber Liggett. I am very excited that I finally finished my research project. And so what I really wanted to do was to get together with all of you and actually come and do this presentation for you. But with our current circumstances, I felt it would be best if I just recorded a video and put together this presentation for you all. And I'm also going to send you my research paper, which is very extensive and very detailed. So the things that are not covered, any kind of questions that you may have, most likely will be answered in the paper. But I just wanted to offer the opportunity, if you have specific questions still after this, feel free to email me, or we could set up a phone call or a video conference and go into further detail. And I have my email address at the end. Since I am graduating in a couple of days, I am not going to put my Millersville email on there. Instead, I'll put my personal email address. So I titled the entire project, Expert Judgment versus Yours, Understanding Local Flood Risk Perceptions. And Dr. Yalda was my primary advisor. I also have Dr. Kim Clocko-McLean, who is a research meteorologist and social scientist out at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, as another author on this paper. And really, this research stemmed from some of her past research looking at tornado risk perceptions. So as I already talked with you a little bit ahead of time, just wanting to bring this more locally for Lancaster County, that's why we focused on flood risks. Let's see if I can, there we go. So the hypothesis that I had for this study was that if people do not understand their risk to flooding, then they will not understand flood safety messaging and will be unprepared if a flood were to impact their homes. The objectives were to identify the flood risk perception of Lancaster County residents, then identify the most effective way to tailor flood hazard messaging to the perceptions of the target audience and enhance safety and reduce loss of life and property. Finally, to provide weather and emergency management experts and local decision makers, so yourselves, with suggested flood hazard messaging refinements. Then digging a little bit deeper into the motivation, looking at some regional historic flooding hazards that you all are familiar with, starting back with 1999, getting this data from XM ACES 2. That is when this dates back to, but I just have a few highlighted dates there. So in 2011, back in September, we had over 13 inches of rain, mainly from Tropical Storm Lee. Then in 2018, the two back-to-back events in July and August. So the atmospheric river flooding event in July of 2018 with flash flooding event following that in August of 2018. So those are some of the more recent heavy flooding disasters that we've had in the area. And then, of course, if we go back to 1972, we see Hurricane Agnes. And so these are some staggered events. They're not happening back to back to back. And so that's why it's so important, as we have people moving in and out of the area, new people, they need to be aware of their flooding hazard in Lancaster County. So that's a lot of the motivation behind this study. So looking at some research on hazard risk perceptions, just a few quotes that stuck out to me from my literature review. People selectively absorb information that's relevant and convenient to their reality. Individuals respond appropriately when they are aware of and understand the dangers associated with a given hazard. And communities with low flood awareness, risk perception, preparedness, and mitigation efforts are more susceptible to sociocultural and economic damages. So the methods for this study, I used Otter AI, artificial intelligence website. It was free to use, and that's what I use for transcriptions after recording the interviews and focus groups. Then I rearranged all of the conversations so the responses were in the order of the questions being asked. Next, I noted what the main ideas were that were occurring in these responses. And then I picked out, once I reviewed those main ideas, I picked out some of the top ones, the ones that I kept seeing over and over, and I called those themes based on recurring messages. So getting into the participants, so I had 40 participants all together, and there were 50 questions. Now, most of those questions were ones that I had created prior to talking with all of you. and the rest of them were the questions that you all had. I incorporated those into everything. So there was a survey given, and then whenever I did the focus group discussions, that's where I incorporated your questions in where they fit best. Now, initially, when I spoke with you, I was telling you how I was targeting Raffo Township. I was also looking at, we had, let's see here, Raffo, and I was looking at Mount Joy Borough. Those were a couple of the areas, but I honestly only had about 8 people come to the 3 focus groups that I was looking at. So I had East Hempfield Township and East Petersburg in there as well. And the people who came to the first 3 focus groups were mostly from Mount Joy and from East Petersburg Borough. So that told me, okay, I need to expand this a little bit more. So initially I had went to some of the borough and township meetings and passed out flyers. I did a lot of word of mouth and social media. A lot of you all helped me out with those flyers as well. And after that first round of focus groups, what I did was expand this so that people didn't only have to come to focus groups. So I added a few more focus group dates, but I also allowed the option for phone or in-person one-on-one interviews. These were operated the same exact way as the focus groups, where people did the survey and then we discussed the questions, the survey questions, and that's when I incorporated all of your questions in there as well. So they still went through the same process, still had 50 questions asked to them in total between the survey and the discussion, and they were analyzed the same exact way. And that's how I ended up with the 40 participants. And so right here in this map to your right, this is the flood study response. And so you'll see we had 6 people from Mount Joy, 5 people from Marietta. So those were the 2 main locations after expanding the survey and study for anybody in Lancaster County. I still found that those 2 areas had the highest response. But we also have East Donegal Township in there, Columbia, West Hempfield Township, East Hempfield Township, East Petersburg Borough, Lidditz, Manheim Township, East Lampeter, Lancaster City, Lancaster Township, Millersville, Manor Township. So we can start to see that a lot of the responses were in the surrounding areas of Lancaster City, so where we see a more populous part of the county. And the categories of questions that were asked range from risk perception, awareness of vulnerability, messaging, and socio-demographics. So for the demographics, we found that people between the ages of 21 and 89 participated in the study. It ended up, by chance, being a 50-50 split of males and females. Education levels range from high school to graduate degrees, and found people from all neighborhood style, suburban, rural, and urban. Mostly they were homeowners. We did have a few people who rented, and most everyone lived with others. And then there were a few people who lived alone. And we found that the household income was greater than 50% were greater than 100,000. So while that's not the typical median income of the county, we found that most of the participants were wealthier, so that would influence some of their answers when we're talking about evacuation plans and places to go and having money for the materials that you would need to prepare yourself. One of the key questions that we asked were understanding of flooding. So when you hear the word flooding, what comes to mind? And so what you see on the left are what participants would define flooding as. So we have large amounts of water, a river running down the street, water ruining your car and the car floating away, rising river levels, backed up storm drains. Then we also see floating furniture, water rescues, my personal flood experiences, what I see on the news, and water in my basement. So we have a large range here when we're seeing what participants define the word flooding as. When we look at what the Weather Service defines it as, we have the inundation of a normally dry area caused by high flow or overflow of water in an established watercourse, such as a river, stream, or drainage ditch, or ponding of water at or near the point where the rain fell. So that is a very extensive and comprehensive definition for the word flood, but it's not what comes to mind necessarily for the general public when they think of flooding. So we have some very extremes, the things I see on TV. I heard people say things like Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Katrina. That's what I think of when I hear flooding. But then some people think of specifically river flooding or just large amounts of water. And then there's others who have said, you know what, I've had flooding residentially on my own, so I just think of my experiences. So flooding can be defined in many different ways based on people's experiences or lack thereof. Another key question is, when's the last time did it flood in Lancaster County? So participant responses varied from not since I lived here to a year ago to I don't know. And then we also see some of the larger events, as in Hurricane Agnes, Hurricane Sandy, and we have Lee and Irene in September 2011 that stuck out to people. So again, this kind of is going back to that point where, based off of how they define flooding, they may look at a puddle on the side of the road after we have some aerial flooding and say that was flooding. Or they might need to see something very large like Hurricane Agnes really destroying a large part of their neighborhood before they consider that flooding in the last time. Another question that a lot of people kind of got flustered with was understanding what a 50-year flood event means. So the FEMA definition is that there is a 1 in 50 or 2% chance that this type of flood will occur in a given year. And people were given the options, this type of flood will occur once every 50 years, or the actual FEMA definition. And you'll see that most people picked the wrong definition. And some of the responses when picking this was that this language is not explained well, it needs to be changed. I can't believe that's not the actual answer. Then there were some people who were like, I've never even heard of this before. And I offered other options too. So after the 50-year flood, I had a question asking basically the same thing for 100-year, 500-year, and 1,000-year. So people were also saying, well, after I saw the rest of the questions, I guessed B logically. So they went back and erased their answer from A, and then they put B, which was the correct answer, the FEMA definition. So in general, people do not really understand what these so many year flood events mean, and they were getting a little frustrated when they think about, oh, I hear this on the news, and maybe if they explain what that means, I would understand it a little better. So this is an opportunity for whenever these major flood events are happening, for us to just go back and actually explain what that definition means when we bring it up, whether that's on the news or whether that's in a forecast discussion, or if it's being put out on social media by emergency managers or meteorologists. Getting into flood watches versus flood warnings. I asked them if they've ever been under a flood watch and if they've ever been under a flood warning. So on the left, you see most people said yes, they've been under a flood watch. Some people were a little confused, and they said, do you mean in my house or in general? And so when they asked that, I usually said in your house, because this is a study focused on residential flooding. And so that's why we have a few no's and I don't knows. And then the same thing happened with flood warning. Overall, people said yes, they've been under both a flood watch and warning. Then I asked them, do you know the difference between a flood watch and warning? And overwhelmingly, people flipped the two definitions, or they did not have an answer for what the two definitions were. So there's still, even though we're seeing this same kind of a question, same kind of an outreach opportunity to educate people on this flood safety vocabulary, it still needs to be pounded into people's heads. I showed them the I gave them the words flood advisory, flood or flash flood watch, flood warning, river flood warning, flash flooding, and aerial flooding. And then I asked them to match them with the correct definitions. And so that's why we have a lot of colors going on for all of these. These are the amount of responses we got for each. Now, the one that was most correct was the river flood warning. 92% of people correctly answered that. And they all said, well, you know, the word river was in the definition. So that made sense to me. So you'll see that one was the overwhelming one that was correctly answered. Now, all of them got the majority of the answers correct. So flood advisory, the majority of people got it correct. Same with flood or flash flood watch, and so on. Then after that, I asked them to rank the severity of flood alerts. So 1 being a least severe flood alert, it doesn't really catch your attention, or you may not think you need to take some action if you hear that. And 6 being, okay, it's time to take action. This is a serious alert. So the ones that stood out the most to people were the flash flooding and the aerial flooding. The ones that did not stand out as much were flood advisory and flood or flash flood watch. So when we get into looking at, you know, why people maybe didn't get the matching question right, or how they ranked those flood definitions, this is what we found. The terms and definitions that were most confusing out of the 6 that were presented were aerial flooding and flash flooding. And the order and difference between warning and advisory and warning and watch, that was something that a lot of people were asking me. So which comes first, a warning or an advisory? And then also, which comes first, a warning or a watch? So these are, again, people are kind of confusing the order of which these come in, and they're just needing to understand better the progression. So they have in their minds what they think it is and what they think is most severe, but we could still do a better job of kind of showing them what the truth is, what is actually more severe. And then again, the severity order of types of flooding. Now, with the severity of flood definitions, as I said, they were least concerned with the flood advisory, flood or flash flood watch. And that kind of goes back to what we see here with flash flooding, is that being a confusing term and definition to them. They were most concerned with flash flooding and aerial flooding. Now, getting into some of the awareness of vulnerability. So 62.5% of people from the study state that they live outside of a floodplain, but understand that flooding can occur outside of floodplains as well. So they're pretty much understanding what can happen with floods, that they're not confined to just a floodplain. And so what you see here is a FEMA map of flood risk. And so it has some of York County, but also Lancaster County. So if I zoom in a little bit here, this is just showing Lancaster County in the northern part of Lancaster County, zoomed in a bit more. And I don't have a map that puts the locations of where everyone was from for the responses of the study over top of this flood risk map. But what I did was put it side to side so that you could see a lot of the places where people are from coincide with where we see some very high, medium, and low risk flooding. So even though a lot of people think that they live outside of a floodplain, especially those who live near streams or the Conestoga River, things like that, they are in a floodplain. So people don't fully grasp where the floodplain is in correlation with where they live. More of them are in floodplains than they think. I also asked them, what hazards are you most concerned with impacting your houses? And the top 3 responses were house fires, termites, and sinkholes. So flooding more so came either in the middle of their ranking or as a low risk for their houses. And so what I have here on your left is a map of Lancaster County geology. So showing a lot of the different limestones and shale, things like that, that lays geology-wise within the county. And just blowing up that legend a little bit more here, a lot of these blues that you see here are limestone. There's another limestone one down here. So again, a lot of the area where people are coming from, you'll notice there is a lot of limestone that sits under there, which is perfect for sinkholes. Then take the fact that these houses mostly were built in the 19th century, so they're a lot older, perfect for termites, perfect for house fires, especially those that were built with wood. So it's understandable why these are their top hazards, though they don't necessarily see the risk that there is for flooding in this area as well. I also asked them how many of them had experience with flooding before at their homes. And so 32.5 of participants did. And I'm glad that I had people who didn't, because initially I was trying to target people in regions where it's very prone to flooding. And so I'm glad to kind of get a different perspective from the people who have experienced flooding and the people who have not. Also, 45% of the participants believe that Lancaster County has gotten more flooding over the years. There were some people who said, we're getting about the same amount or even less flooding. So I asked all of them, well, what are some of the reasons why you think we're getting more flooding? Mostly people said development. Other people said climate change. Those were the two big responses. And so with development, I asked them even further, do you think that development is causing more rain and flooding in areas where we hadn't seen it before? Overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. Furthermore, most people are aware of their vulnerability as they understand that when there is flooding, electrical wires, loose articles, and bacteria can linger in the flood waters. I asked them if they feel safer on their first floor, second floor, or attic if there is a chance for flooding in their neighborhood. We did get a couple of people to say attic, and so I did explain to them why that is a terrible idea, but mostly people felt safest on their first and second floors. And I asked specifically why the first floor, and two reasons behind that were, I don't want to get stuck on my second floor, and I want to be able to access my car, to get out of my front door, access my car if I need to evacuate. So then talking about evacuation, 38% of people said they would wait until there was over 10 inches of water in their home before they leave. 23% said they would evacuate with 7 to 9 inches of water in their home. And 22% said they would go with 4 to 6 inches of water in their homes. So a lot of this is because mostly, again, people think they live outside of floodplains, and some do. And also a lot of people live on higher ground, either hills or just in general a higher ground. And so they're saying, well, I have a basement, so if water is going to get into my basement, I'm okay with that actually not evacuating because it's not on my first floor. And that's why we're seeing numbers of 4 to 6 and 7 to 9. But then we see some people saying they would wait till over 10 inches of water is in their house because they're like, well, there could be 40 inches of water and it still won't impact me because I live on a hill. And so, you know, you hear those responses, but they're not thinking of the full picture where, okay, you live on a hill, but at the bottom of that hill, there is ponding water and you wouldn't be able to leave your house. I mean, you could leave your house, but you can't leave your neighborhood because of that water. So people aren't seeing the full picture. They're aware of their home specifically not being in a flood area, but they're not thinking of the full picture where, you know, just because my home isn't doesn't mean my neighborhood isn't. I also asked if any of them have lived outside of the county and how where else they've lived compares to Lancaster County when it comes to flooding. So one person lived in Bloomsburg and they found that the flooding was worse there. Same thing with Easton, PA, it was worse out there. One person lived in Altoona and found flooding to be worse in Lancaster County. And Jersey City, they found that they said the flooding was different because you have coastal flooding versus inland flooding, but overall they found flooding to be worse in Lancaster County. Baylor, Tennessee, they said because this is a rural area, they believe that this area of rural Tennessee is more susceptible to flooding than rural Lancaster County because they have less resources out there than we do in Lancaster County. And finally, coastal New York, again, a different kind of flooding, but one is not worse than another. So different perspectives on how people look at flooding between Lancaster County and other areas. I asked them about different types of insurance, starting with homeowners insurance. Most everyone had homeowners insurance. Out of those that did not say yes, they had renters insurance, all but one person. And so I asked, well, does that cover flooding? And in a way, it was a trick question because most cases the answer is no, unless you have a rider. And there were a few people who did have a flood insurance rider and actually had to use the rider back in 2011 and or 2018. Now, most people did not have flood insurance, and I asked reasons as to why not. A lot of the responses were that it was too expensive. One person actually said they tried to get flood insurance, but their insurance company said, you don't live in a floodplain, so you can't have flood insurance. And so they were very confused about that. So there's an area to kind of talk to people more about whether or not they live in a floodplain, if they can have flood insurance. That's a great area that people have a lot of confusion around and would love to know more information. But then 43% of people said they never even thought of getting flood insurance until we started this discussion right now. So I also asked, did anyone have other hazard insurance? And there were a few people who did. There was earthquake insurance, sinkhole insurance, and fire insurance. Digging more into the floodwater safety, about 47.5% of people had walked in more than 6 inches of floodwater, and using that 6-inch threshold as that is the amount of water it takes to be able to knock you off of your feet. And going a little bit deeper into that, I asked, so why were you walking in that? Some people said it was because of their jobs at work. Some people were rescuing people. Other people had just worked in a field where they said they still had to go to work that day, and so they had to walk through some water. Other people said, oh, I was just a kid when that happened, so, you know, I was being rebellious and I didn't listen, and so I walked through the water. Then I asked them about driving through floodwaters, and 32.5% of people said they either have or would drive through floodwaters. And so I said, okay, what would it take to get you not to drive through flooded waters? So if water was touching the bottom of their car, or if the road was blocked off, they said they would not go around any kind of barriers. If the road was fully covered with water and they couldn't see the ground anymore, if they saw someone else trying to go through the water and their car didn't make it, or if they got stuck, they would not try it themselves. Others said if their tires were covered, or if they see wires or other cars, again, stuck in the water. And then there were a couple other responses. So, well, it depends on how well I know the area. So that's a really dangerous one. I think a lot of people who are local and who have been there for many years, these are the people that fall into this category. If they're really comfortable and they think, I know exactly where I am, I'm just a mile or two away from home, I'm just going to go right through, that's when bad things start to happen. People get stuck and so forth. Then lastly, they said, it depends on which vehicle I'm driving. If I'm driving my car, probably not. If I'm driving my big truck, I think I can make it through. So these are some of the factors that people consider before driving through floodwaters. And I think it's important to really know this so that we can kind of tailor a message in a way that we acknowledge these possibilities and say, don't drive through waters, even if you're in your high vehicle, because while you may not think that you can get stuck, it's still possible. Or, you know, part of the road may have eroded away and you can't tell. These are the kinds of concerns that we can take into account when making messaging. Another key question was understanding the steps to take after your house has been flooded. So this is as far as talking to your local officials, talking to your insurance companies, talking with VOADs, and 17.5% of people did not know what to do. They said, I don't even know what I would do if my house flooded. But then 15% of people said, I would just prefer to figure it out on my own. And I did find that this was mostly people who lived in rural areas of the county. They did say, I just want to, I can figure it out. Me and my family will be good to go. We'll get the sump pump out and we'll handle things. Then there was 12.5% of people who said they would call their insurance company as the first step. So you could see there's a different range of, what's going on after a flood. And I think this is definitely an area where our local emergency managers can really reach out to the people in their community a little bit more and just tell them what all of their options are for if your house floods at any point, as opposed to just calling your borough or your municipality and starting to ask questions once it happens. If they know it ahead of time, then they'll be more prepared and hopefully be able to handle things and not overload your local municipality office with questions afterward. Getting back into messaging. So asking about the phrase, turn around, don't drown. If you've ever heard this slogan, most people have, about 60% of people, but then I asked, do you know where it comes from? And most people did not. Some people guessed emergency managers, some people guessed police officers, broadcast meteorologists, but only 15% guessed correctly that it was from the National Weather Service. But I thought it was interesting because even out of the people who guessed it, there were a couple of individuals that said, well, it might come from the Weather Service, but I think they hired a marketing company to come up with that slogan. So of course I let them know that that's not the case. It was actually created by employees of the Weather Service. So, and they do have a communications office, so that does help. But I just thought that was interesting, kind of hearing people's commentary about it and seeing that while the phrase is known, where it comes from still can be promoted a little bit more so that people know about the Weather Service. Then when we get into what kind of verbiage people prefer to hear in order to capture their attention, in order to tell them that there's some severe weather heading our way or some severe flooding heading our way, specifically looking back at those Weather Service warnings and alerts, flash flood emergency, flash flood warning, and flood warning stood out the most. A couple people did mention that they remember having a flash flood emergency for the August 2018 flooding event, the flash flooding event. And they said that's the only time I've ever seen that, and I knew it was serious. So that's great. People are understanding that that's a critical message and alert to come across. Then with descriptive verbiage, it really helps whenever you use verbiage so that people can visualize. Because as I said, the majority of these participants had never experienced residential flooding. And so it was hard for them to kind of visualize what that would look like, so that it was even more difficult for them to understand what they would do if their house flooded, or to visualize, how many inches of water would they actually tolerate in their house before they would evacuate. It was just difficult for them to kind of think all of that through. So using descriptive verbiage like quickly rising water or water reaching the bottom of your car or your ankles, that helps them to visualize and say, oh, okay, I can kind of understand what that would be. And so now I know whether or not I need to move things to higher ground, whether I need to evacuate, those sort of things. And then finally, descriptive verbiage about flooding. So asking them if they were watching the news and were listening to their local broadcast meteorologists, or if they were reading a forecast or looking at social media and seeing, some different messaging talking about heavy rains, downpours, extreme flooding, damaging flooding, these sort of words, what's going to capture their attention most and tell them that there's some severe flooding heading their way? So they said extreme, damaging, and major flooding. And it's because they don't hear these words as much as heavy rain. So they hear heavy rain and they're like, oh, whatever, we get heavy rain all the time. It's not going to be that big of a deal. But if they hear extreme, damaging, major flooding, they're like, oh, okay, this is serious. We don't hear that as often. So that speaks to the fact that we don't want to overuse these words, but that we do keep that verbiage together for whenever there is going to be some serious flooding event heading our way. When we talk about what our go-to sources for receiving flood messaging are, you can see there's a long list of options that I gave everyone there on the right. So we do have some people still using NOAA weather radios or listening to public radio, but the overwhelming majority is TV broadcast meteorologists. And so I asked specifically, was that local news, national news? Mostly it's local news. And even more specifically, it's mostly WGAL. And they said that's because they didn't think the other local news stations were forecasting for Lancaster County. And so I had to explain to them that yes, they all have the same viewing area. So they're all forecasting for Lancaster County, even though they're not located in Lancaster County like WGAL is. There were some other people who said they'll watch any of the local news stations. The next highest ranking were various weather apps. So some of them were just saying the Apple or Android app, but mostly I heard WeatherBug, the Weather Channel, the local news station apps, or even AccuWeather. And the Weather Channel itself on TV was the next highest go-to source. And lastly, the internet. So on the internet, that's where I heard NWS website, the local news station websites. Those were the two main ones. And there were like one or two people that said, oh, I'll just go to Google and type in weather and see what pops up. So that's when I did give everyone a list of recommended, well, not give them physically, but I told them of some recommended weather sources. So I did tell the people who didn't mention WeatherBug. WeatherBug's great, especially if you want to get some free lightning data. You could see where the lightning is for free, how close that is to you. So a lot of people liked that feature. I did tell them if they wanted to pay, they could do radar scope and get some really great radar data in there as well, some imagery. And I did suggest AccuWeather, the Weather Channel, versus using the Apple or Android apps, because I told them how, some of these other apps are more reliable. For preferred method of receiving flood messaging, so I said, okay, these are your go-to sources, but how would you prefer? What would be the easiest way for you to get your messaging? So I really thought this question was probably the most intriguing to me. I heard the alert notifications would sound like the EAS alerts, something like that that's localized would be great. Something that sounds different than my phone alarm or a text message alarm, something like that big bing that you get with the EAS alert, or a municipality-wide text message service, or even an app. And lastly, a TV banner with sounds on all channels and not just the basic cable stations, it makes so much sense since a lot of us are streaming our TV now or using Dish. And that, though, I know is not something we could do tomorrow. I know that would take a lot more coordination and using services almost like, especially with the municipality-wide text messages, you would need to get with a service like Everbridge, for example. And so I know, because one of the weather service employees had asked this question, are there a lot of municipalities doing this already? And after talking with just a few people on the front end of this, I'm finding that no, that's not in place already. So that is definitely something, and I don't know, I haven't done the research to see if there's any either free or less expensive companies that can be utilized for this other than Everbridge, but I know there are other systems out there and that people would love to have this just so that they can be more aware. Like I know there's Nextdoor, but Nextdoor isn't necessarily going to give the same kind of information. Like you're not going to be able to do this through Nextdoor, but I know a lot of people are using it and they love it and they're checking that often. So I think a municipality-wide app or text messaging service would be greatly appreciated. So then the other question related to go-to messaging was, how frequently do you check it if you know there's severe weather coming? And most people, so 36% of people said they would check it twice a day. They also had the option to say they would check it once a day or continuously check it throughout the day. And then people who were just already ahead of the game and more hyper aware of weather information, asking if they would do it multiple days ahead of time. There were a couple of people who said, oh, I'm just gonna wait for someone to tell me. I don't watch the news, I don't do anything. And no, it was not just millennials. There were some people who were in their 40s who said that as well. So there's always going to be people who really don't care. But as you can see, the majority of people are either checking it once a day or throughout the day or a couple of times a day. So one of the last key questions asked was flood messaging expectations. What are your flood messaging expectations for meteorologists? What do you want broadcast meteorologists to tell you? What do you want your weather service forecasters to tell you? And they specifically said, I want to know what neighborhoods are going to be impacted by this rain or with flooding. I need to know the timing and the duration of this. If you can provide rainfall estimates, that would be really helpful, as well as expected levels of floodwaters. And so none of this comes as a surprise. We've heard these things over and over again. This is just reiterating what people would like to know. And then for emergency managers. So what was interesting is the way I worded the question for this one, I said, what are your flood messaging expectations for your local officials? But the answers that they gave me all were for basically emergency managers. That's basically what an emergency manager does. So they said they want them to be able to disseminate information ahead of time, be prepared before something happens. They want them actively monitoring the weather, being vigilant of citizens' well-beings. And then whenever, that's all kind of like the before. So during the storm, they want to hear updates where the flooding is and areas to avoid. As you can see, that is a great overlap with what meteorologists are putting out. So that's the tie-in between the two fields. And then also for emergency managers, just to be supportive, to kind of comfort the citizens and let them know, like, you know, here's what's going on, but everything's going to be, not necessarily everything's going to be okay, but everything, you know, just here's what you need to know. And as long as you're staying informed, you'll have good chances of getting through this. That sort of support is what they were looking for. And after the storm is over, especially when it's time for that recovery and cleanup, they want to hear resources. They want to know where they can get funding. And they also want to have some cleanup tips. And so I know especially the people who were in Marietta and let's see, people in Mount Joy, those two areas, they said that a lot of the post-storm cleanup tips were really helpful. So what was interesting, a funny story from Marietta was they said after Hurricane Agnes that a lot of people from the Amish community came and helped with recovery. They said there was just like about 100 people from the Amish community that came and helped with recovery and helped that process go really fast. And that was very helpful. Another interesting story was after the flooding in 2018 over in August in Mount Joy, they said that what the kind of assistance that they had with the trash cans, the major dumpsters being left out for all of the debris, that was very, very helpful. And they said they did notice some people taking advantage of it who maybe didn't have flooding and they were just putting their regular trash in there, but they said that was really helpful. So anything like that, that sort of continued help is what they're looking for in the future from their emergency managers and local officials. So overall, a few key takeaways were that people who live on high ground and or people who haven't experienced flooding in the past are not as worried about flooding damaging their house versus some of the other hazards, like you said, fires, termites, and sinkholes. The preferred way to get messaging across to someone is through the municipality-wide app or alert on their cell phone, and then utilizing TV banners with sounds. So again, like you usually get during when you're watching the basic cable stations, but getting that on all channels if there's going to be an alert that people need to know about. Then if people don't, since a lot of people don't know how flood insurance works, they need to understand that better. So, you know, that is something that can easily be done with just a flyer or adding a section on municipality website and then guiding people to it, not just putting it there, but guiding people to that part of the site, or even in a monthly newsletter, putting out that information to tell people, especially since it's springtime now, and we're going to see some spring and summer flooding, now is the right time to kind of get that information out. And I know I already saw it on a lot of websites that I looked at within municipalities in the county, But again, it's like that reiterating. People need to hear things over and over before it starts to sink in. And then we all know that sometimes it takes a major flood event before it captures people's attention, and they just have a short attention span after that. So it is a challenge, but just continuing to reiterate the same information over and over. It's also important to continue to stress the flood severity, but not overuse hazard wording. And we'll always find this next point to be true. There needs to be more outreach and education about flooding. And as I mentioned, they understand the risks with other hazardous weather phenomena like tornadoes and high winds, lightning. They understand that a little bit better than flooding. And again, I know some of the meteorologists I talked to on the front end here were saying, hey, those are the more flashy things. That would make sense to me why those stand out more. But especially as we have so many colleges in the area and just people moving in and out as there's more development, it's important that everyone is just consistently aware of the risk for flooding in the area. And lastly, we can further simplify flood alert definitions. And for the emergency managers who are listening to this, there already has been a lot of that going on with the hazard simplification program through the Weather Service. And there are some flash flood alerts that have come out for EAS that are a little bit different than they have been in the past. And those just were rolled out, I think, a couple of months ago. And so this is happening, but just to reiterate that it can continue to happen. And so, as I said, I have some acknowledgements here. So thank you to everyone. As I said, if you have more questions, please, please, please reach out to me. I'd love to stay in contact about this because this is just a really exciting project. And I think there really hasn't been anything like this done before. And so there's a lot of room for expansion on it. There's a lot of room to really just take this to other counties and even talk about other hazards just in flooding. And I'd love to be a part of that. And again, I'm attaching my full paper here so that you can get some more details for things that I didn't necessarily mention here. And I know this was a bit long, but I wanted to give you a thorough understanding of how my process went. So thank you so, so much for listening and taking some time out. And also thank you for just being of assistance, especially at the beginning of this project, getting it rolling off the ground. Have a great day.